This is a small peasant knife from Svord, made of Bandsaw Steel, hardened in the mid-50s. Slightly modified from the original because this came with relatively heavy secondary edge bevel, and I ground that off. So this is one continuous grind now right to the edge, and I sharpen it with micro bevel. This improves cutting ability, edge retention, ease of sharpening. Collie Harris from k390 Knives actually sells these, and he takes this grind right up to the spine. It was very light convex on it. Very nice job. Looks much nicer than this grind as well. Would improve all those characteristics further, and I may do that at some point in time. But it's on one extreme of steels for knives. Low abrasion resistance, low to mid in terms of hardness, but very high toughness, very high grindability. Ease of sharpening is moderate, and I'll get into more of that a bit later, and corrosion resistance is almost negligible. This steel will rust so fast that if you're cutting onions or acidic foods with it, and you can almost see the rust form right on it during the cutting, and definitely if you lay it down with the juices on it, you wouldn't even be able to eat an apple before you'd actually see rust form on the blade. This is an EDC from Ozark Traditional Knife Works. It's made out of k390. It's hardened in the mid-60s. One of the most extreme alloy steels you can get, unless you move to things which are arguable, even if they're steels or not. Something like 121 Rex, which is sort of in between steels and solid carbide. Similar to CPM 10V in terms of alloy content. So of course, extremely hard, very abrasion resistant. Corrosion resistance is much higher than the Bandsaw steel, but grindability is very low, toughness is very low. So an interesting question to ask is, given that these two steels are so extremely different, like I said, they're on extreme ends of the spectrum, what kind of differences do you actually see in use? This has also been modified from the original state. I reduced the edge bevel down to around 8 degrees per side, and again that's to increase cutting ability and edge retention. It lowers ease of sharpening in this case because it's made the edge bevel much wider, and now I have a wider strip of material to sharpen. So I tried to compare two of these before on some garden hose, but the garden hose was neither hard enough or abrasive enough to blunt either one of them. So both of them stayed equally sharp, no significant difference. Recently I got some relatively heavy, dirty polypropylene rope. So that has to be abrasive enough to tell the difference, because it'll blunt both knives down to very low levels of sharpness. So the plan was to take the two knives, cut up the polypropylene rope until they were relatively dull, without doing careful measurement, see what kind of differences I could see, and repeat it a few times to see if they were consistent, and I'd be able to form a conclusion. The problem is though, it took 100 cuts on that dirty rope to even get the Svord knife really dull without careful measurement. Because even after the full 100 cuts, it was still cutting the rope. But I could tell it was significantly harder than in the beginning, and the rope was also fraying more, splitting the rope apart. So it was very dull. The EDC also cut 100 pieces of rope, but felt significantly sharper during the cutting, less force, and looked to cut the rope a bit cleaner. These kind of conclusions though are very difficult to form because you're not doing any measurement, you're just going by feel. But it's interesting to do them every now and again, and they answer a question which is more important to most people. Because most people are not really interested in the question, well, if I do very specific, very controlled cutting and all the forces are measured, do I see a difference? most people are interested in the question, if I just use these, will I see a difference? So, unfortunately, because it took 100 cuts, I couldn't repeat it fully the second time, let alone a third time. But I did another 60 cuts, and similar sort of pattern was noted, that the EDC from Ozark Traditional Knife Works took less force. So if I added up all the force that I used, calculated sort of the work that I was doing, it was less with the Ozark Traditional Knife Works, which you would kind of expect. The interesting thing is, though, that's not the only difference. So after I had made all my notes, qualitative judgments, I started doing some actual measurements to see what the measurements said in comparison to what my feelings said. Because that's kind of an interesting thing to look at. The edge retention on the Svord came through a very different mechanism. There was no rolling, there was no fracture, no chipping, just very slight wear. So it just rounded the edge right off. So if you look at the edge under 50 times magnification, you just see it rounded off. It's just smooth. The k390 blade, though, blunted in a completely different manner. It chipped, fractured, pieces came out of the edge. Again, not unexpected. It has much lower toughness, and the carbide volume is much higher, so the apex stability is lower. The interesting thing is, though, that chipping is very likely the reason why it had much better edge retention. Because if you look at the pictures, you'll see the chipping is highly irregular. It's angled. So if you can imagine, now all those little chips grating along the knife, they'll catch and tear like little serrations. I then measured the sharpness, and the slicing aggression was twice as high on the EDC blade as on the Svord. And again, I attribute that possibly to the fact that the EDC blade was chipping, and that's probably what was accenting its edge retention. Still not the only difference. To sharpen them, I use a Bester 700 waterstone. I just glued a piece of wood to the bottom of the stone with Gorilla Glue, because I can just hold on to the wood. Because the stone is getting that thin, I can no longer hold on to the stone. So, very large difference when you're sharpening. So, when you take the Svord, put it on the Bester. This is a mid-range stone. Relatively decent hardness, not super hard for water stones, but much harder than something like a king. The Svord has an excellent feeling. You can feel the abrasive cut into the knife. The abrasive cuts in deep enough that it can get torn out as it starts to wear. You build up a decent slurry on the stone. Just very nice feel, very efficient sharpening. And I could sharpen the whole bevel on this Svord relatively quickly. The EDC from Ozark Traditional Knife Works, however, are completely different. It's very hard, very high carbide content. And while initially you get that same nice aggressive feel, it very quickly turns into a glass-like feeling, where the knife is sort of slipping and sliding rather than being cut. And the reason this happens is because as the abrasive wears down, it's not biting into the knife deep enough to get torn out, and it just smooths out really fast. So you end up with a stone that's very smooth on the surface, because all the abrasive has been flattened out. Whereas with the Svord, because the abrasive is constantly refreshing itself, and you're getting that constant grinding action, you constantly get that consistent feel. But the EDC will actually, because it's wearing the abrasive, not really having any of it freshly released, it'll actually start to load the stone at some point. So this is not the stone if you want to do anything significant like change an angle or something on this, because the stone would load up and in order to actually keep it working, you actually have to lap it. And it actually took me longer to sharpen this little bevel on the EDC knife than it did sharpen the whole primary grind on this sword, and that's because the difference in grindability is so much lower. So the interesting thing is, if you look at the question of which one had better edge retention, well, if you look at it from the point of view is which one required more force, which one required the minimum amount of force and thus had the best efficiency, easily this. But which one lost the most material, also this. Which one lost the least amount of material, which is interesting, and was fastest to sharpen, the sword. To be clear though, I don't think this knife is at its sort of maximum potential yet. Like a lot of knives, it's been power sharpened, and a lot of knives that have etches. I shouldn't say a lot. I've only used 4 knives, I think, so far that have had forced chemical etches on them, and they've shown consistent behavior, which is that as you sharpen it, and the edge retention, ease of sharpening, edge durability, all rises relatively rapidly. So it isn't something I'd ever do to a knife, but a lot of people like the look of it. But it's only around 4 knives I've seen. It could be a completely random thing, but I don't even like the look of it. I think it's completely silly, but that's up to you. Onto the stone, you have to lap this stone rather frequently when you're working with steels like this, because again, they don't cause fresh abrasive to be released, so the stone wears down and smooths out, and you don't get very nice cutting action. You get a lot of galling and stuff. This is all I use to lap it. I get these cheap stones all the time as gifts from friends. You can get them for as low as $2 and as much as $4 locally here. They're not tremendously great stones to sharpen with. They have a large amount of binder or a small amount of binder depending on the stone. It's almost never balanced the way you would want it. Either there's so little binder that the abrasive just peels right off, or there's so much binder that none of it will be released and the stone galls over. The abrasive is generally not overly of quality. But I mean, it's perfect for something like the Svord, which again, its grindability is so high it'll sharpen on pretty much anything. But for much beyond that, not great to sharpen with. But very easy to lap with. So again, all I did was mount a piece of 2x2 to it with some Gorilla Glue, and I use this as my lapping stone. Now, I just want to mention a couple of things that are not very commonly talked about. The first one is, when you're lapping, it's almost guaranteed to be the case that you won't press with the same amount of force along the stone. So you start off, depending on who you are and how you're holding it and positioning, and you're sort of moving like this. Well, when you start off, you're probably going to be pressing harder than you will at the end, or you'll be pressing harder at the end than you were at the start. Depends on where you are and how you're standing. But it's very unlikely that you're going to get the same amount of force over the stone. Why is that important? Well, if you put more force up here, you'll grind more material off this end. If you put more force down here, you'll grind more material on this end. So what you'll end up with is a stone that can have a completely flat surface. So if you look at this, if you put a ruler on this, it'll go right across this. It's completely flat, but it can be tilted. So it could be like this, as an extreme example. But it could be much thinner on this end than it is on that end. It doesn't make any difference to me because of how I sharpen. But for some people, if they're laying the stone down flat on a surface, and if they're judging an angle off the surface of the stone, and the stone is tilted like this, it's obviously going to affect the angle. And that can cause some problems. So you can imagine, especially when you're switching stones, if you have your base stone, which is thinner here than it is up here, your stone is going to be tilted like this, which will magnify the edge angle. So all of a sudden you'll think you're at 15 degrees here, but you're actually at 20. You think you're at 15 degrees here, you're closer to 10, so your bevels will get all scoured up. If you then go to another stone which is inverted in the other way, you'll have the complete opposite effect. And that's one of the reasons why some people get frustrated when they're switching stones, because the surface of the stones are not, while they're flat, they're not perpendicular to the bottom part. So if you watch me when I'm lapping the stones, you'll see that I often spin around both this stone and I often spin around this stone, because again, I want to smooth out and get an average amount of force which is equal over the whole stone. And I also periodically measure all the corners and make sure they're the same height. And if I notice a corner is significantly higher than the other one, I just write high on this with a pencil mark, and then when I lap it, I press a little bit harder at that and even it out. It's not overly complicated, just a few simple things, and you'll resolve that. The other thing is that when you start off lapping this stone, it will have hollows in it, obviously. Those hollows will actually mirror themselves in this stone. So this stone will wear unevenly to sort of match the unevenness that's in this stone. And one of the ways to stop that from happening and ensure both stones end up flat is that you have to change this stone. So it's like this, then it's like that, then at times you'll see me do this, and then at times you'll see me switch from going like this to going in circles. And again, the reason that I'm doing that is that I want to get an average or consistent wear over all of this stone and all of this stone, so that they both stay flat and even. And then at the end, I just knock off all the edges and knock off the corners. So that's a little bit about lapping. Now, I've tried off and on again to not lap the stones, to try to conserve as much material as you can. And it can be done, and Murray Carter has a video where he talks about this, and about looking at where the stone is and where it's high and sharpening on it, and you can do it. The problem is, though, even with a lot of focus on my part, I can never get this 100% to stay 100% flat. There'll always be little dips and hollows in it. And then you'll say, well, what difference does that make? The reason that it makes a difference is any little dip and hollow will change the angle on the knife. So again, you put the knife on this, you think you're at 15 degrees, it rides down into a dip, and now it's up to 20 degrees. And that could just be in one area of the blade. So if the dip is right here, this part of the knife will be at, say, 20 degrees, but if the stone is flattish up here, it doesn't have a dip, this will be at 15 degrees. But the next time you pick up the stone, pick it up like this, the dip is over here now. Now when you go to sharpen, this is at 20 degrees, but this part's at 15 degrees. But it was at 20 degrees the last time you sharpen it, it wasn't have the dip there, so now nothing is happening. The tip gets sharp immediately, the bottom doesn't get sharp at all, and you end up getting very frustrated because nothing seems to be happening. So you can compensate for this once you know that it's going on and you have wear in the stone, and you can do that, and I've done it as well. I've let this run for as long as 15 to 30,000 passes without lapping it. But I get much more efficiency out of it in terms of my time, and much more consistent grinding and angles out of it if I lap it no less frequently than after about 5,000 passes on this stone. And after about 5,000 passes, if I lap it that frequently, or I'll have to lap it even more frequently if I'm using knives like this, again, because they cause the stone to be glazed over. But every 5,000 or so passes means that the lapping usually only takes around 50 to 100 passes with this cheap stone, which is just a couple of minutes work, and everything is fine, and we're back to 100% again.